Greetings, friends, and welcome to Wake Up in the Word for Tuesday, November the 5th, 2024. An important day in history, and I'll talk about why I've got the Peanuts cup this morning in just a few minutes if you'll stick around toward the end. It's an important day because it's, of course, Election Day 2024 for a lot of our Baptist family in North Carolina. This is the day of the North Carolina Baptist Convention. I told them they should move that, but that would have been too expensive and a few other excuses, and so they're having it over in Greensboro today. But it's also something else that's most important in our family. Today is our anniversary. Sue and I celebrate 48 years of marriage. What a wonderful blessing to be able to say God has allowed us to come this far together. She is the love of my life, and we met in the most unusual of places, at church. Yes, I recommend that. Please don't go looking for a spouse at a bar or on some crazy website. Get involved with God's people and God's family, and God will send you a good life partner. Well, as we get into today's devotion, we've got to cover something that apparently really goes with even the election we're dealing with right now. Who's the greatest among you? Well, Jesus is dealing with this because his disciples are talking about it. It's in all three of the synoptic gospels. And I'm going to go to Luke and go backwards, Luke, Mark, and Matthew, because Luke deals with this in the shortest, most succinct way. And then Matthew's going to give us some more details. So we're in Luke chapter 9, beginning in verse 46, where it reads that an argument started among the disciples, about who was the greatest of them. But Jesus, knowing their inner thoughts, took a little child and had him stand next to him, and he told them, "Whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes him who sent me. For whoever is least among you, this one is great." Well, he's already putting out this least of these kind of banner for the disciples to recognize that real greatness comes from servanthood. How does Mark's gospel put it? Well, it says in chapter 9, verse 33, that they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asks them, "Well, what were you arguing about along the way?" You see, he knew what they were arguing about, but he wanted them to talk about it, so he just asks the question. Of course, he knew the issues up front. Verse 34 says, "But they were silent because on the way they had been arguing with one another about who was the greatest." See, now they're embarrassed over the fact that, oh my goodness, Jesus knows what we were talking about. Here we go. We're in trouble for this one, guys. Can you almost feel the tension in the room? So in verse 35, it says, "Sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, 'If anyone wants to be first, he must be last and servant of all.' He took a child, had him stand among them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, 'Whoever welcomes one little child such as this in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but him who sent me.'" Now we're getting the lesson, I think, but for one last opportunity, let's let Matthew take us into this same scenario and see if there's anything that changes about what Jesus says. This comes from Matthew chapter 18. Beginning in verse number 1, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'So who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?'" So apparently they were very quiet, didn't want to discuss what they'd been talking about, but they did bring up a question. Well, okay, Lord, who's greatest in the kingdom, the whole kingdom of heaven? And did they really expect him to name one of them at that point? Well, now keep in mind the disciples have been taken from a very humble position in their lives, and they've seen miracles of God. They've been a part of this. Jesus has given them authority, even over demons and sickness and disease. And it's amazing the change that's taken place in these guys as they have been discipled by the Lord Jesus Christ himself. So now all of a sudden they're beginning to pat themselves on the back. They see how God's been working through them, and they're beginning to say, "Hey, we're something else, aren't we?" Well, again, Jesus calls a child in verse 2 and had him stand among them. Truly I tell you, he said, unless you turn and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So he makes this entirely different. Hang on, he's talking about the faith of a little child as that which is necessary to enter the kingdom of heaven in the first place. He said in verse 4, therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child, this one is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one child like this in my name welcomes me. Now, he's going to expound some more on this. We'll read about that tomorrow. But today the point is this. Greatness comes from servitude. Those willing to serve and give themselves. You know, we see that from the smallest of examples, what's happening in your neighborhood when, it's that person that showed up unannounced with the chainsaw and some friends who got the trees off your house after the hurricane, or who brought you some food when your refrigerator went out, everything spoiled, and you needed something to eat. They didn't ask for payment. They just did it because they care, because they love you. Servitude. It's that same attitude that we see happening all across our part of the country right now as people just volunteer their time and give themselves to help others. It's a characteristic that Jesus talks about over and over in the Gospels. And it's one that we hope to see in those that are serving us to be elected to offices to serve from our local communities and school boards right on up to the White House. As you've been watching these campaigns, it's interesting to see how some people spend an awful lot of time and money trying to even bring in actors and others, trying to make themselves look good to the people while they're really just putting on a show. Others who actually get out and put their hands out and do something. And I think it's been one of those campaigns where we've had politicians who've had every opportunity to show who they really are, and they've done it. You may not know about it, but yes, they have, in every single case, they have stepped up and shown their true colors. So it's time for you to go out and elect from the top to the bottom, a president of the United States and all the way down to the smallest community positions that are available. And who should you be voting for? Well, number one, there shouldn't be any question that you should be out voting. Yes, you should do that if you haven't already. But secondly, you ought to do something else. You ought to be putting your Christian values next to the candidates on those ballots and vote for the ones that carry your values. Well, it's all over after that. In this particular case, this election, it's been one of those clear-cut ever. You can go look at my video from Saturday if you want to get some specifics, but it seems like everything on the ballot has a viewpoint that's either Christian or non-Christian, even for the people that you're voting for. And so it's a very clear-cut election. You need to let your voice be heard if you're a Christian citizen. Now, when it comes to these kind of emphases, we've got to get ourselves back in gear off of being pious and sitting up on a high horse like some of the disciples may have been during these questions. Well, I'm just so great. You know, some people can be so heavenly minded they're no earthly good by saying, well, you know, there's no one on the ballot that I would want to vote for, so I'm just going to stay home and I'm going to sit in my holy of holies and not participate this year in this election. And if you do that, here's what I think will happen. I actually listened to Mark Driscoll on a video the other day. You don't have to agree with Mark on everything to enjoy what he says sometimes. He had several good Christian candidates at his church praying over them there in Arizona, and he said, listen, folks, you've got to know Jesus is not on the ballot this year. But I tell you what, Jezebel is. And if you either don't vote or vote for Jezebel, you'll be responsible for this nation going down the tubes even farther. Well, I think with those kind of comments, you and I know that this is an important election and we ought to be out there to vote. Which brings me back to the coffee cup. Bear with me as I remember something very special. The Royal Guardsmen had a song. It was in the top 40 back in 1968. And it basically went like this. The time had come in 68 to elect a president. And all the famous candidates thought they were heaven sent. They screamed and raved and pounded their hands upon their hearts. But soon the noble promises were hard to tell apart. Waiting at the pumpkin patch, a dog sincere and brave. And everybody hoped that soon the country he would save. The pumpkin said, the day has come for you to take a stand, for love has left the people across our native land. The chorus goes like this: somewhere the sign of the elephant, somewhere the sign of the mule, but we'll hold the sign of the beagle high, and love will shine right through. It was a funny song for the day, but it kind of took the edge of tension off of one of the most tense presidential elections in our history. You may not be old enough to remember that. I remember it poignantly as a 12-year-old. And there was a time in which there was a lot of frustration. You know what held us together? It was a time in which our values were what we were looking to. We were trying to clarify those during a time in which some had declared God is dead. And instead, the people of God were rising up and talking about a Jesus movement and trying to bring revival. Which of those two won out? Well, I think the winner is not clear because the struggle has continued for these generations. But my friends, the struggle is what we're here for. And the greatest among us is the one that's going to continue to serve, continue to share the gospel, and continue to hold up the banner of love. And that, my friends, is John 3:16. You have a great day, and I'll see you again tomorrow when we wake up in God's Word.